In the world of NHRA pro stock drag racing, where races are decided by thousandths of a second and millions of dollars ride on tenths of horsepower, the line between innovative engineering and outright fraud has always been razor thin. But there was a period in this sport's history when that line didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. This is the story of the illegal engines that rocked pro stock, the scandal that threatened to destroy the credibility of America's most competitive factory-backed racing series, and the men who were willing to risk everything for speed. Welcome to a chapter of motorsport history that continues to echo through the pits today. To understand how cheating became so rampant in NHRA pro stock, you first have to understand the unique pressures that defined the sport in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Pro stock wasn't just a racing category, it was a showcase for American automotive excellence. Dodge wanted to prove Mopar was superior. Chevrolet wanted to prove the big block was king. Ford wanted its share of glory. With factory budgets flowing like never before, with sponsorship deals worth seven figures, and with the winner's circle offering not just trophies, but validation for an entire manufacturer's engineering department, the pressure to win transcended normal competitive intensity. It became existential. The cars were spec cars, bound by seemingly ironclad regulations designed to keep the playing field level. Engines were limited to naturally aspirated configurations with specific displacement numbers. Transmissions had to be factory units. Bodies had to maintain stock profiles. Carburetors had to remain within approved parameters. On paper, it was all supposed to be equal. But in the real world of high-stakes motorsport, where engineers with IQs off the charts and budgets without ceilings collided with rules written by committee, the gap between what's allowed and what someone might try was infinite. It started with whispers. In pit areas across the country, from the Gator Nationals to the U.S. Nationals, racers began noticing something peculiar. Some teams seemed to have more power than their engine displacement should have allowed. The differences were small, fractional even. But at the elite level of pro stock, fractional differences determine winners and losers. Those whispers grew louder when one legendary competitor decided he'd had enough of staying silent. Bob Glidden, a former pro stock champion and one of the most respected voices in drag racing, began making accusations. He claimed, publicly and repeatedly, that some of his competitors were using nitrous oxide to artificially boost their horsepower. Nitrous oxide, commonly called NOS, or laughing gas, is a chemical compound that significantly increases engine combustion when injected into the intake manifold. It's powerful, it's effective, and it's absolutely forbidden in pro stock. The problem for NHRA officials was that Glidden didn't stop with vague accusations. He went further. He said his own sons had used it. That personal revelation transformed the conversation from rumor to confession. The technical sophistication of how these systems were hidden was genuinely remarkable. One method involved concealing the nitrous solenoid inside the brake booster, with the activation line running through innocuous vacuum lines that looked completely stock. Another approach hid the injection nozzle inside heater hoses. Engines arriving at the dyno had dummy battery boxes constructed specifically to house solenoids. Motor plates were gun-drilled, precision-machined with small holes that concealed the lines running to hidden injectors. The activation switch required multiple simultaneous conditions. The ignition had to be on, the computer had to be programmed a certain way, the engine had to be running above a specific RPM threshold, and the throttle had to be completely open. Standard tech inspections would miss all of it. Even if an inspector fired up an engine on the dyno and ran it, they might not trigger the system. It was hiding in plain sight, concealed within the very components they were authorized to inspect. When NHRA officials initially responded to Glidden's allegations, they didn't embrace the investigation with enthusiasm. Graham Light, then the senior vice president of NHRA, essentially dismissed the claims as fiction. The sanctioning body appeared reluctant to conduct the kind of deep investigation that nitrous accusations would have warranted. Some observers at the time believed this reluctance wasn't accidental. With Chrysler Dodge being a major financial backer of pro stock, an official investigation that found the Dodge Boys, as Scott Jeffrian and Darrell Alderman were affectionately known, using illegal nitrous would have created an enormous embarrassment for the manufacturer. The suspicion was that NHRA, benefiting from Dodge's substantial investment in the sport, was content to let sleeping dogs lie. But then came May 1995, and events took a turn that would define the scandal for decades to come. On a night that seemed perfectly ordinary, someone broke into the Wayne County Speed Shop in Michigan, home base for Dodge's most dominant pro-stock operation. Or at least, that's what the official story claimed. The break-in was thorough and surgical. 6 high-horsepower pro-stock engines were destroyed with hammers. The bodies of the cars remained untouched. The transmissions were untouched. The drivetrain components were untouched. The machinery and tools in the shop were untouched. Only the engines were systematically destroyed. To many observers in the drag racing community, the whole scenario smelled wrong. Why would a burglar take the time to destroy 6 engines with a hammer, but ignore everything else? Why not steal the cars? Why not trash the transmissions? Why not destroy the entire operation? The more people thought about it, the stranger it got. The FBI investigated. Insurance companies looked into it. No burglar was ever caught. And when the Wayne County team attempted to resume racing, they claimed that developing replacement engines that could compete at the championship level was proving remarkably difficult. The team withdrew from competition for nearly 2 years. Some of the most respected voices in pro stock at the time harbored serious suspicions about whether the break-in was genuine at all. Warren Johnson, one of the greatest pro stock drivers in history, spoke openly about what he believed was really happening. According to Johnson, the break-in was self-inflicted and part of a brokered agreement with NHRA. The theory went like this. NHRA knew the Dodge Boys had been running illegal nitrous. Rather than face the PR nightmare of busting the sport's most dominant team and embarrassing the manufacturer, a deal was made. The team would destroy their engines or appear to stay out of racing for a while, and when they returned, NHRA would look the other way on future infractions. The FBI and insurance investigators reportedly pursued this scenario but never officially confirmed it. But the theory persisted for good reason. When the engines from that famous break-in eventually found their way to Pat Musey's New Jersey engine shop for dyno testing, the results were startling. Those engines tested 30 to 40% down on horsepower from where they should have been according to their specifications. Whether they'd been damaged during the supposed break-in or whether they'd never been as powerful as claimed remained a mystery. Through the 1990s, the rumors persisted, but it took a dramatic catastrophe to prove them definitively true. By the late 1990s, despite NHRA's apparent reluctance to prosecute cheaters aggressively, the practice of running illegal nitrous oxide in pro stock had become so prevalent and so obvious that catastrophe was inevitable. Tech inspections were increasing, scrutiny was intensifying. But some teams continued operating in the shadows, believing their systems were undetectable. Jerry Eckman, an accomplished pro stock driver, was running with crew chief Bill Orndorff, a talented mechanic with a reputation for pushing boundaries. In 1997, at the National Trail Raceway near Columbus, Ohio, during the days before a national event, Eckman's team was preparing for qualifying. Orndorff had installed a nitrous system, hiding the bottle inside the oil cooler. It was a clever idea on paper. Cooled by the oil circulation system, the nitrous bottle wouldn't generate excessive pressure from heat buildup. But theory and reality have a way of diverging violently in high-performance automotive environments. When Eckman fired up the engine for a warm-up session, the oil temperature began to climb rapidly, as it does in racing engines under load. The ambient heat transferred to the nitrous bottle. As pressure inside the bottle increased, the metal walls began to expand. Within moments, the bottle ruptured violently, creating an explosion in the pit area that echoed across the track. The incident was impossible to conceal or deny. Officials were on the scene immediately. The evidence, a small metallic canister confirmed to contain nitrous oxide residue, was undeniable. The investigation that followed was thorough because the sanctioning body had no choice. This wasn't a team making vague accusations or a mysterious break-in that might have alternative explanations. This was a visible, chemical, undeniable piece of evidence. Jerry Eckman was hit with a suspension, banned from NHRA competition for 2 years, and fined $50,000. Bill Orndorff's team faced sanctions as well, but Eckman maintained that he had been made a scapegoat. He insisted that he wasn't the instigator of the illegal activity, and that he had been pressured into accepting responsibility for crew chief Orndorff's actions. Years later, after his suspension ended and he attempted to rebuild his career, Eckman spoke about the incident with surprising equanimity, ultimately supporting NHRA's efforts to police the sport. But the damage to his career was permanent. What should have been the prime years of a talented driver's career were spent on the sidelines. But perhaps the most shocking confession of all came from someone who had the most to lose by revealing the truth. Years earlier, long before the dramatic explosion that exposed Eckman, Rusty Glidden, son of Bob Glidden, who had been making the accusations all along, stepped forward with a public admission that sent shockwaves through the sport. Rusty revealed that he had indeed used nitrous oxide in his pro-stock Ford probe, and not just once, but systematically. More shockingly, he disclosed that his qualifying engine had been run on fuel blends containing approximately 85% nitromethane. To put that in perspective, some pro-stock teams occasionally ran nitrous up to 25% concentration when desperate for qualifying power. 85% was unhinged, absolutely extreme in its aggression. Rusty described the technical details with remarkable specificity. The shock switch had to be on. The computer switch had to be activated. The engine had to be running. The throttle had to be completely open. Only when all those conditions were met simultaneously would the nitrous flow into the intake manifold. It was a system designed to be invisible to standard inspections, and it worked, until it didn't. Rusty's confession validated everything his father had been saying for years. It proved that Bob Glidden's accusations weren't the bitter complaints of a sore loser, but rather observations grounded in reality. It also proved that the cheating was systemic, not isolated to 1 or 2 rogue operators. If the Glidden family, revered for their accomplishments and integrity, had operated illegal systems, and if the Dodge Boys had run them, and if Jerry Eckman had been caught with them, then the question became, how many other teams were doing it? How many races had been won with illegal equipment? How many championships were tainted? The engineering sophistication behind these illegal modifications was genuinely impressive, which makes the moral compromise all the more troubling. Teams didn't just bolt on a nitrous bottle and call it a day. They integrated the systems into engines with an understanding of pressure dynamics, chemical reactions, and electronic control that bordered on brilliant. Nitrous oxide systems required precision tuning. Too much fuel delivery and the system would overlean the mixture and detonate. Too little and you didn't get the power gain you'd invested in. The activation had to be coordinated with ignition timing, fuel delivery, and engine load. The delivery nozzles had to be positioned for optimal atomization. Every component had to be hidden within the confines of engines that were subject to teardowns and inspections. The fact that some of these systems remained undetected for years speaks to how carefully they were engineered. And nitrous oxide was just the beginning. Teams found other ways to gain illegal advantages. Some began experimenting with active ride height adjustment systems that would lower the car's nose during launch for better weight transfer. Others discovered that by using differently sized tires, legally engraved with misleading markings, they could alter gearing ratios without technically violating regulations. Transmission modifications became increasingly sophisticated. Clutch pack configurations that should have been illegal somehow made it through inspection. Carburetor jetting was manipulated in ways that weren't immediately obvious during technical review. Engine builders created elaborate dyno facilities at their shops where they could test combinations that never made it to the track intact. It was an endless arms race between innovation and detection. By the end of the 1990s, the cumulative effect of all this cheating began to corrode pro stock's credibility. The class that was supposed to showcase stock block American horsepower had become increasingly disconnected from the vehicles it supposedly represented. Costs skyrocketed because teams needed to build multiple engine configurations to escape detection. Talented drivers found their career options limited if they refused to participate in the cheating schemes. Good people, genuine competitors who wanted to win fairly, looked at what was happening and felt disgusted, and manufacturers like Chrysler, which had built its racing reputation on Mopar power, found their achievements increasingly questioned. Did Dodge win because they had better engineers or because they were better at cheating? NHRA eventually moved to address the nitrous problem more systematically. Tech inspections became more rigorous. Random teardowns increased dramatically. The sanctioning body developed more sophisticated testing protocols. But by then, the damage to the sport's integrity was substantial. When you've spent years allowing teams to operate with illegal systems, when you've potentially looked the other way because of manufacturer pressure, when you've failed to prosecute suspected cheaters aggressively, you've created a credibility problem that's difficult to repair. The evolution of pro stock following the nitrous scandals reflected an attempt to reset the sport's direction. In 2016, NHRA mandated electronic fuel injection for all pro stock cars, a move that was supposed to bring the class closer to modern automotive technology, while also creating opportunities for more precise rules enforcement through ECU monitoring. Shorter wheelie bars were required. Hood scoops were eliminated. The engine RPM was capped at 10,500, a limit that some argued unfairly disadvantaged Chrysler's big block engine designs. The changes were sweeping and sometimes controversial, but they represented NHRA's effort to restore control over the category. Yet even with all these modifications, even with technological advances that should have made cheating harder, pro stock continued to face rules violations. In 2024, supercharger pulley specifications for factory stock showdown competitors created controversy when Chevrolet teams were found to be using non-compliant components. Erica Enders, one of the greatest pro stock drivers in history and a six-time world champion, found herself at the center of a 2024 controversy involving beadlock wheel specifications. The NHRA disqualified her qualifying run, docked her 100 points, and levied a $5,000 fine. Team owner Richard Freeman protested vehemently, arguing that the rulebook didn't specifically prohibit beadlock liners and that the punishment was disproportionate to any actual performance advantage. The incident reflected a broader frustration. The rulebook had become so complex, so open to interpretation, that teams were constantly discovering gray areas. What the pro stock cheating scandals ultimately reveal is something fundamental about high-performance motorsport. When you create a regulatory environment that is supposed to be spec and equal, but where millions of dollars are at stake, where factory support hangs in the balance, where careers are made and broken on milliseconds, you create an environment where the pressure to push boundaries becomes immense. The boundary between legitimate engineering development and fraud becomes dangerously ambiguous. Teams rationalize their activities as simply finding gray areas in the rulebook. Crew chiefs convince themselves that if a part isn't explicitly forbidden, then using it is acceptable. Drivers tell themselves that they don't know what's under the hood, that it's not their responsibility to police their own team. Manufacturers, benefiting from victories but not wanting to be officially implicated in cheating, maintain plausible deniability. The men and women involved in the pro stock cheating scandals weren't necessarily bad people. Many were just racers trying to compete at the highest level in an environment where they believed everyone else was cheating, where staying legitimate meant accepting a competitive disadvantage. Some were engineers so brilliant at problem solving that they couldn't resist the puzzle of hiding illegal systems inside legal ones. Some were crew chiefs pushed by owners and sponsors to find ways to win any way possible. The system had created conditions that rewarded rule bending and punished compliance. For NHRA, the legacy of these scandals has been complicated. The sanctioning body walked a line between protecting the sport's credibility and protecting manufacturer interests. It was often criticized for not being aggressive enough in prosecution, for allowing well-connected teams and manufacturers to escape consequences that would have been levied on smaller operations. But it was also constrained by the reality that without manufacturer support, pro stock couldn't survive. The The sport depended on Dodge, Chevrolet, Ford, and other manufacturers bringing technical resources and sponsorship dollars. Aggressively punishing those manufacturers for cheating by their contracted teams could have resulted in them withdrawing from the sport entirely. Today, NHRA Pro Stock exists in a different context. The class has stabilized around regulated specifications that attempt to balance innovation with control. Technology has evolved in ways that make certain kinds of cheating harder to conceal. Electronic fuel injection systems can be monitored remotely. Engine management computers store diagnostic data. Teardowns are more comprehensive and more frequent. The era of nitrous oxide systems hidden in brake boosters feels like ancient history. But the fundamental tension remains. In a sport where success is measured in thousandths of a second, where engineers with unlimited resources are incentivized to find competitive advantages, where manufacturers measure success in terms of championships won and brand prestige earned, the temptation to cheat will never fully disappear. The scandal of illegal engines in NHRA Pro Stock wasn't just about the specific infractions, the nitrous oxide, the illegal components, the destroyed engines. It was about the environment that made cheating seem rational, even necessary. And until that environment fundamentally changes, until the pressure to win is balanced against the commitment to fair competition, until rule enforcement is truly consistent regardless of manufacturer status, until the sports authorities are willing to take on powerful teams and manufacturers in the name of integrity, the lessons of those scandals will remain essential to remember. The story of Pro Stock's cheating era is ultimately the story of an industry learning hard lessons about integrity, credibility, and what it means to govern a sport fairly. And it's a story that continues to influence how NHRA polices its categories today.